This video was made at the request of one of my patrons, Shaan M. Thank you for your support. Havana Syndrome is the name given to a collection of apparent physiological symptoms reportedly experienced by US and Canadian government staff while in Cuba. The earliest reports of the phenomenon emerged in 2016 and began to increase rapidly as the issue gained attention. Original reports only mentioned a high-pitched noise being heard on a semi-regular basis, but the number of symptoms began to proliferate by the end of 2016, ranging from dizziness and fatigue to insomnia, headaches, and ear pain. Early investigations focused on reports that symptoms coincided with the high-pitched noise apparently heard by several US staff members, all of whom were CIA agents. Eventually, it was suggested that staff were being targeted by a device using weaponized sound. It should be noted that if you're the staff of a global nuclear superpower which is engaged in military, political, and economic tactics aimed specifically at destroying a specific nation, you shouldn't really be surprised if the locals of that nation express their distaste for your presence in their country while you're working there. Medical practitioners were confused by the strange combination of symptoms, and the Cuban government denied any responsibility, proposing that the US government was simply fabricating the phenomenon. However, in 2018, a neurological study at the University of Pennsylvania, published in the Journal for the American Medical Association, seemed to establish hard evidence for the elusive illness. This study supposedly found symptoms similar to concussion in the brains of US diplomatic staff, which was attributed rather vaguely to, quote, an unknown energy source, end quote. This sensational conclusion was promptly exploited for political capital, with the US State Department citing it enthusiastically as evidence that Havana Syndrome constituted, quote, medically confirmed symptoms, end quote. News of the study quickly spread around the world, and Havana Syndrome was suddenly taken very seriously by many people within the broader academic community. The following year, the US National Academy of Sciences was asked to investigate Havana Syndrome. In December 2020, the report's conclusions were leaked to the media, which was quick to spread the news that the National Academy of Sciences had concluded Havana Syndrome was most likely the product of, quote, directed radio frequency energy attack, end quote. This was justified by citing the Frey effect, the scientific phenomenon of clicking sounds being heard by an individual when pulsed microwaves are directed at their head. This report became highly influential in discussions of Havana Syndrome and can be found repeated in many scholarly articles on the subject. The Russian government had used microwaves to irradiate the US embassy in Moscow from 1953 to 1979. Although the effects of these microwaves were never confirmed as harmful, this was nevertheless seen by some as a relevant precedent which could explain the so-called Havana Syndrome. However, a 2019 study argued that although studies of the radiation used in Moscow could not definitely confirm it was harmless, nevertheless, there was still no solid evidence that the radiation was harmful. Consequently, the Moscow incident was of little significance to the alleged Havana Syndrome. The 2018 study, published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, also came under closer scrutiny, showing the study itself did not provide any evidence that the diplomats examined had suffered any significant changes to their brain's white matter, and no evidence of actual brain damage. In 2021, bioengineer Kenneth Foster dismissed completely the idea that the Frey effect could be responsible for the Havana Syndrome, arguing the idea of microwave beams being responsible for the reported clicking sounds was, quote, just not possible, end quote, adding, quote, the idea that someone could beam huge amounts of microwave energy at people and not have it be obvious defies credibility, end quote. Richard Tell, a specialist in electromagnetics who once worked for the Environmental Protection Agency, likewise commented, quote, to cause brain tissue damage, you would have to impart enough energy to heat it up to the point where it's cooking. I don't know how you could do that, especially if you were trying to transmit it through a wall. It's just not plausible, end quote. Closer examination of other claims made revealed they were equally weak. Many reports of alleged mysterious sounds were proved to be merely noises caused by insects. Social conditioning was also identified as responsible. Diplomats posted to Havana were not only warned that they may experience the Havana Syndrome, but were even played sounds which they were told typically accompany the effect. These sounds turned out to be the natural calls of crickets and cicadas. Diplomats subsequently hearing these sounds in Havana were thus already conditioned to identifying them as the mysterious syndrome. Medical sociologist Robert Bartholomew argues that priming staff in this way created, quote, an expectation of illness, end quote, and a, quote, classic setup for an outbreak of mass psychogenic illness, end quote. In 2021, the US government opened a new investigation into Havana Syndrome, but this time the tone being taken is much more cautious. In fact, there is evidence that the government is starting to realize there is no real illness involved. In 2021, American news service CNN published details of a State Department report on Havana Syndrome and claimed the report, quote, concludes that the US government's response and investigation into the so-called Havana Syndrome may have been botched from the beginning, end quote. On the 20th of January 2022, the Washington Post published an article observing that a CIA investigation of Havana Syndrome had decided that, whatever it was, a foreign power was unlikely to be involved. Over the last 3 years, a number of scientific and medical studies have continued to cast doubt on the idea that the Havana Syndrome is a genuine physical phenomenon caused by external influence on US staff in Cuba. This supports Robert Bartholomew's firm conclusion that Havana Syndrome is, quote, a social panic that has been aided by sensational journalism, dubious science, social media conspiracy theories, and government bureaucracy, end quote. Finally, I'd like to thank my generous patrons: Elias Asvig, June Barnett, Alexander Curzon, Sean A. Young, Andy Chaos, TBLTP, Niels Rethelin, Matthew Simmerall, Thomas Leonard, Martin T., Ben Lindquist, John Larkin, Love You More, Noah French, Aaron Johnson, Emily Cougar, David Johnson, Be the Heretic, Shaan M., Waymore Odhi, and Dusty Bob. Thank you so much for your support, and please contact me if I ever pronounce your name incorrectly.